of a disaster under the sea.
A head-on collision at 40 miles per hour is by any standard a bad accident. But a head-on collision in a submarine 525 feet deep in the middle of the Pacific Ocean is a disaster. That's exactly what happened to the USS San Francisco when it struck an undersea mountain in one of the worst accidents in modern naval history. How does a submarine run into a mountain? And whose fault was it? The answers may surprise you. But first, you'll hear the crew of the San Francisco tell you how they survived 52 harrowing hours at sea. This is what a $1 billion fast-attack nuclear submarine looks like. This is what the San Francisco looked like after the accident. Its entire bow shattered.
We took a full frontal hit.
How close do you think you came to losing that sub?
I think we came pretty close.
Commander Kevin Mooney was the sub's captain on that day in January.
I do accept full responsibility for the grounding of San Francisco. I expected the Navy to hold me accountable for this horrible accident, and they did.
Mooney was a rising star in the submarine force, handpicked to skipper the San Francisco on its peacetime mission of sneaking around the Pacific and spying on other countries and their navies. And in the 13 months since he'd taken command, he'd won accolades for his leadership. Then, 4 months ago, he and his crew were sent on a high-speed run from their home port on the Pacific island of Guam south to Australia for a port visit. They were passing through the Caroline Islands at a depth of 525 feet when 7,000 tons of steel with 137 souls on board came to a crashing halt.
The noise was deafening. Initially.
Deafening like a
explosion.
Mooney was eating lunch in the wardroom and was thrown across the table.
What was your first thought?
My first thought was that I was going to die.
And all of a sudden, you find yourself slammed into something, and the whole world's shaking.
Senior Chief Danny Hager was in the sub's control room and smashed into the instrument panel.
And immediately, I knew that we'd hit something, and it was going to be bad.
I remember just bodies everywhere.
Petty Officer Brian Barnes was standing in the lunch line and was thrown to the deck.
Broken glass, stepping on plates, your shipmates moaning because they're in pain, yelling.
We had a lot of people thrown, you know, up 20, 25 feet. Those were the guys that were injured the worst because, you know, there's not very many soft things on a submarine.
Those still able began to take stock of the damage. Flooding is what every member of the crew dreaded most. At 525 feet deep, the water pressure is 16 times what it is at the surface. If there were any serious leaks in the inner hull, water would come rushing in and doom the ship within minutes.
The enemy is out there, and it's seawater, and it's trying to get in.
The crew of the San Francisco performed what's called an emergency blow, pumping air into the sub's ballast tanks to float it to the surface. All eyes turned to Hager, who was monitoring the depth gauge.
I told him 525 feet, zero acceleration, and I'm waiting. You know, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, I don't know how long it was. You know, 525 feet, zero acceleration, and it was just absolute silence and control because they were waiting for me to report that we were accelerating upwards.
And all you've got to say is 525.
525 feet, no acceleration.
What they didn't know at the time was most of their front ballast tanks were destroyed.
So the forward tanks were ruptured, and that air you were trying to pump into them was just going out into the ocean.
Just going out into the ocean.
Finally, air filled the rear tanks, which slowly began pulling the sub up.
You could feel the pregnant pause, and then almost the relief when I said 500 feet, acceleration upwards.
How long did it take to get this up to the surface?
It took a few minutes.
Must have been about the longest few minutes of everybody's life.
It certainly was.
Getting the San Francisco to the surface was just the beginning.
The crew had to get that ship home. An injured crew, a beaten crew.
A terrified crew.
Yes, I think the crew was terrified. There was blood all over the decks.
98 of the 137 crew members had been injured, about 20 of them seriously enough that they could no longer man their watch stations. Petty Officer Joey Ashley was the worst off with a massive head injury.
Basically, he'd flown about 20, 25 feet and struck a pump head first, and he was in serious critical condition.
Mooney radioed for help, but the San Francisco was hundreds of miles from home, and there were no ships nearby. Its bow was crushed, its propeller bobbing in and out of the water, and the crew wasn't sure they could keep it from going down. As the hours passed, the crew struggled to put the submarine back in some kind of working order, while at the same time caring for the injured, especially Petty Officer Ashley, who was given an emergency tracheotomy to keep him breathing.
Everyone kind of switched off with Ashley. They kind of stayed with him 24/7, around the clock, just holding his hand, taking care of him.
When word came that a rescue helicopter was finally en route, Ashley, who was strapped onto a stretcher in the bowels of the submarine, had to be moved through a labyrinth of tight passageways and up a narrow ladder to an exit hatch 25 feet above the main deck.
We were cutting off railings and just doing anything we possibly could to ease the passage of that stretcher from where he was down in the crew's mess up to the area right below the bridge hatch.
This is video of the helicopter hovering over the San Francisco.
The water was washing over the top of the submarine.
And with the wave movement and the submarine moving, it was really dangerous.
That's how we were unable to get him in his stretcher through the bridge hatch.
So when the stretcher comes up like that,
right,
it's hitting the hatch and you can't get it past the hatch.
Couldn't squeeze it through.
Ashley clung to life for more than 24 hours, but the failed attempt to airlift him off the sub had literally been his last gasp.
When they brought him back down from that was when they lost him. It's pretty sad.
Yeah, real sad. One of your best sailors.
One of the best on board.
The crew had no choice but to press on in a sub once capable of doing 40 miles an hour underwater, limped home on the surface at only 10.
And how long did it take to get her back?
52 hours from when we grounded to when we moored in Guam.
So now the San Francisco sits in dry dock here on the island of Guam. You can't see the worst of the damage anymore because a steel shield has been placed over the bow to make it seaworthy enough to sail to the States for permanent repairs. It will probably cost $100 million and take 2 years to put the San Francisco back in service. So how could this accident have happened?
Dive! Dive!
For all their sophistication, nuclear-powered submarines run virtually blind to what's in front of them, relying mostly on their charts to navigate safely. They could use sonar to detect an obstacle, but its distinctive ping would give the sub's location away and violate the submariner's rule, run silent, run deep. The Navy's investigation blamed Mooney for using poor judgment in his navigation of the San Francisco. It went on to say he failed to appreciate potential hazards, went too fast, and, most importantly, failed to review his charts adequately. He was relieved of his command and given a career-ending letter of reprimand.
The real punishment for me is that I have to carry the consequences of this grounding with me for the rest of my life, particularly the death of Petty Officer Ashley.
There's now a video tribute to Ashley at the Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C. You might think his parents, Dan and Vicki, would blame Mooney for their son's death, but they have forgiven him his mistakes and believe some of the responsibility for what happened goes much higher in the Navy.
I want him to stand up and take responsibility, just like Commander Mooney and his crew. It would be nice to hear him stand up and say, yeah, Mr. Ashley, we screwed up too.
The Navy investigation didn't exactly admit to a screw-up, but it did find that an omission on one of its charts directly contributed to the grounding. This is the chart the San Francisco was using when it ran into the mountain. It's one in a series of bottom contour charts which the Navy considers the most complete and accurate for underwater navigation. It's not available to the public, so we can't show it to you in detail. But I'm looking at it, and I can see the course Mooney followed and the exact spot where the collision occurred. and there is no sign of anything resembling an undersea mountain.
They gave you a bum chart. The Navy gave you a bum chart.
Right. It's regrettable.
There were other charts on board, including this one, that clearly show a navigation hazard near where the San Francisco grounded. And the Navy says Mooney and his team were required to look at all the charts, not to rely on the accuracy of just the one.
My biggest mistake, or the area where I fell short the most, I think it was I did not have a healthy skepticism on the accuracy of the charts. Had I appreciated that the charts really are not that accurate, then I would have navigated my ship more prudently.
It turns out Mooney wasn't the only one who trusted the faulty chart. So did the submarine headquarters, which laid out the basic route the sub was to follow from Guam to Australia. A route which pointed it straight at the mountain. A route which another report said did not follow an optimal track.
Did you follow the track that you were given?
Yes.
And that's the track that ran you smack into that undersea mountain?
Yes.
And that's your fault?
Yes.
Because?
The safe navigation of a submarine is the responsibility of the commanding officer.
It's what the Navy calls the essence of command. The buck stops with the captain of the ship.
The standard that the submarine force holds me and every other person to are high because they have to be. We can't afford to have another San Francisco.